Well, there is a new pandemic of sorts, not the type of pandemic you're probably thinking of, though. It's a pandemic of whistleblowers coming forward and admitting that there are all sorts of safety concerns inside the airline industry, pilots, veteran pilots. But the pandemic isn't around the whistleblowing, it's around the retribution that's coming now after the pilots. The pilots come forward, and then they have their careers destroyed as a result of it, tarnished, shamed, all sorts of fake stories dragged up about these different pilots. We've interviewed a number of them here on Redacted. My next guest is the co-founder of the Whistleblowing Airline Pilots Association, Captain Doug Green, and he has a fascinating story to tell. Captain Doug Green, welcome to the show. Great to see you.
Clayton, it's a pleasure to be with you. And as we spoke earlier, you're one of the last bastions of justice in America as we know it.
Well, thank you for saying that, but we really wouldn't be able to, do this show or be able to bring these stories to the American people or to the world if it weren't for the bravery of individuals like yourselves and some of these other pilots we've spoken to around this particular story who've called out airline safety problems, training problems, disasters waiting to happen in our nation's skies. And then instead of being honored and rewarded for telling the truth, they lose their jobs. They go through medical evaluations, and they're told that they suddenly have bipolar disorder. They have their careers ruined. And this is happening all across the airline industry. So thank you for your bravery in trying to bring this story to the American people. How did you come to this? What was the catalyst for you to start helping these whistleblowers and try to protect the airline industry?
Well, just to give you a little background, Clayton, I've been in the aviation industry as a whole for about 41 years. I started out years ago as an air traffic controller with the FAA, and then eventually I went to Air Force pilot training. And then my career progressed after Air Force pilot training into commercial aviation. And I have 7 different type ratings. I'm currently still qualified on the Boeing 777-300. And I have approximately 25,000 hours of total flying time. I've been to Aircraft Accident Investigation School. I was also a federal flight deck officer after 9/11. And so I have a pretty diverse background of experience. And safety for me has been always one of the utmost priorities throughout my career. And I didn't want to ever have to be afraid to write an airplane up. I didn't think pilots should have to be afraid to call in sick if indeed they really are sick or fatigued. The FAA has a mandated fatigue risk management program, and they also have career source management program, which we can talk about more detail, and a safety management system program. And all these programs are meaningless if they're not enforced. And as my career progressed, I eventually became a pilot for United Parcel Service back in 1994. When I worked my way up through the ranks, first as a DC-8 first officer, and then eventually I flew the 747-100, 200, and then I upgraded to captain on the 757, 767, and then flew the MD-11, the 747-400 at UPS. And in 2013, UPS has had a very dysfunctional safety culture over the years. And there were several mishaps at the company throughout my career there, 20-year career, that they unlawfully ended based on false pretenses. And it was in approximately 2013. Well, first we had UPS 6. It was a tragic crash, a preventable crash that should have never happened, flying from 747-400, flying from Dubai to Cologne, Germany. And but I'm going to elaborate more on 1354, UPS 1354, going into Birmingham, Alabama. It was an Airbus 300. And the crash was directly related to fatigue. And pilots at UPS are disciplined if they're calling sick or fatigued. And even the National Transportation Safety Board investigation, Robert Somold identified that fatigue was one of the reasons for the crash. And he basically told the company, you got a problem with your corporate culture. You need to go back. You need to fix it now. And Shonda Fanning and Saria Beal, who are on that flight, the cockpit voice recorder revealed that they were both fatigued. And Shonda had spoke to one of our other colleagues that was in the union who was part of the fatigue risk management program. And she had spoke to him that night, and she explained to him she was fatigued, but she was afraid to call him fatigued because of retaliation. And after during the National Transportation Safety Board investigation, the union was mandated by the National Transportation Safety Board to conduct a survey. And almost 95% of the pilots admitted that they were terrified to call in sick or fatigued because they would be subject to discipline up to and including termination. This came out in the survey. And so Shonda didn't call in. And nonetheless, I became embroiled in a labor dispute with the company and the union. And unfortunate to say, Clayton, most of the unions in the United States are company-controlled unions, especially the smaller independent unions, of which the Independent Pilot Association is one of them. The companies learned how to control the union, and the union is actually a labor containment arm of the company. And so subsequently, everything falls on deaf ears. We have a collective bargaining agreement, but it's not enforced. And so you're pretty much on your own. Well, in this circumstance, I had raised concerns about safety and security. And I'm a manager at UPS, and it's a little bit of a different situation at UPS. They have a management pilot group and they have a union pilot group. One of the managers was a close friend of mine, and he had alerted me that they had falsified my FAA record, and I was on their radar because I was vocal about safety and security. And so I was falsely alleged of harassment. They said that I was harassing pilots because I was talking about the actual harassment that was being taken against me because I had been vocal about safety and security and the ability to call in sick, and the fact that my FAA record was falsified. And there was overwhelming evidence that this was true, and I have a copy of it to prove it. But nonetheless, he was a little bit concerned, and he wanted me to go in and get a copy of it myself, just so that they wouldn't know that he had given it to me. And so I was insistent that they remove this falsification of my FAA record over a trivial matter that wasn't even true, but they did it on purpose. And so when they called me into a meeting at the chief pilot's office in Anchorage, Alaska in August of 2013, during this meeting, I expressed my concern of why am I even being called in here? I've done nothing wrong. I had an impeccable record of safety, security. You know, I very rarely ever called in sick, 6 times in 20 years. I never called in fatigued. I was a model employee, never failed any physicals in my entire career. I never failed any check rides or simulator events. And so I had brought out my concern over the mishap of UPS 1354, which happened just a couple days, 2 weeks earlier. And I had addressed the fact that pilots are afraid to call in sick here. They're afraid to call in fatigue. And I'm fairly certain that fatigue was an issue with the crash of 1354. And whenever you go into a meeting with UPS, you're recorded. They record everything. They won't conceal that they're recording it, but they are. We know this. And so subsequently, I had a handshake agreement with the chief pilot at the time, who was subsequently fired shortly thereafter, that we were going to put this matter to rest. He alleged that some pilots had complained about me. It was complete falsification. They had manufactured everything. But he says, well, if you stop talking about the things you've been talking about, then we'll put this matter to rest. So I had the handshake agreement. I thought it was over. And I was just going to keep my head down and just continue doing my job as I'd always done in the past. Well, subsequently, when the company got the audio file of our meeting, of which I also have, because if ever you go into a meeting with UPS, you have to record it yourself to protect yourself. It's standard operating procedure. We call this SOP. And so subsequently, when they got the recording, they had heard my conversation, bringing up the crash of 1354 and how I felt it was related to the crew being fatigued. And so one day later, I was removed from my schedule, and discovery, over 6,000 pages of discovery that were received 24 hours before an arbitration hearing, 9 months late when it was supposed to be received in 30 days, revealed that they basically had gathered what I call a posse, which were people from labor, attorneys. It was occupational health. And it was basically they came together to fabricate a story to target my career because I had raised these concerns about 1354. So the next thing I knew, I was immediately withheld from service, which was a contract violation. I had done nothing wrong to be withheld from service. And they progressively, canceled all my flights incrementally while they spent 3 months building a case against me that was based on lies. They had 3 pilots, basically were troubled pilots, that they coerced to make false statements about me. These pilots, one had an undisclosed DUI, one had stole tens of thousands of dollars from the company. Michael Starnes was the guy that had the undisclosed DUI, and Mark McDermott, he had stole tens of thousands of dollars from the company in fraudulent moving expenses. And another crew member was in fear of being penalized for calling in sick, and also because he was an instructor and he didn't want to use his rating. So they were coerced to make these cockamamie stories up about me. And I never even flew with these guys, Clayton. And they were totally fabricated. I filed a grievance with the union. And I said, these statements are false, and I want to have an arbitration hearing before a systems board. And so subsequently, once I filed the grievance, the union had to entertain it and file it as well. And I was waiting and waiting and waiting. Well, in the meantime, I filed an air whistleblower complaint with the U.S. Department of Labor, because one of the pretenses in which they targeted me is that one of the managers, he had alleged that there was a TSA incident report about me, which was a lie. It never even existed. And so there's too many moving parts here to go into too much detail, given the amount of time we have. But the long and short of it.
But yeah, all these people came together to fabricate stories about you in order to discredit you.
Exactly. And they had actually falsified my FAA record, which is the kiss of death. If anything ever happens.
They actually falsified. Who was it at UPS that actually falsified your record?
It was UPS. Now, indirectly, they have a law firm named Frost, Brown and Todd. They use an outside law firm, and their primary go-to guy is an attorney by the name of Tony Coleman. He should be disbarred. He's guilty of fraud and corruption. He's targeted countless UPS employees, too many to count. And he basically gave the order to falsify my record. And so they drugged me into 2 disciplinary hearings, manufacturing the suggestion that I had harassed pilots because I was talking about this, but they were false statements from these guys that I never even flew with. And so subsequently, he slid the exception history, which is a part of my FAA record, and it showed where he was lying because he had changed it. As I told you earlier, the original manager that was a friend of mine who tipped me off, he had sent me the original copy, and he had completely changed it. And he had edited it and they had suggested that I had inappropriate, unprofessional conduct. I had gone through a security screening months earlier as a jump seater. When you're a pilot, you can jump seat on other airlines. And I used to jump seat on Federal Express all the time. And as a result, I had a house in Alaska and I had a house in Florida. So I'd commute from Fort Myers through their main hub in Memphis and into Anchorage. And I had a pair of grooming scissors in my shaving kit that were not against TSA requirements. And I had no problem clearing security in Fort Myers or in Memphis. But when I got to Alaska, I had to go through an exit screening. And the purpose of the exit screening is because of loss prevention. But the young lady that was doing the exit screening, she didn't understand. And she asked me as I was going to the parking lot, she screened my bag. And keep in mind, I'm a federal flight deck officer, and I have a duty weapon. But she was worried about this very small scissors with a blade about 1 inch, and which was not a prohibited item. And so she didn't really know her job. And so she called the chief pilot, but she didn't explain to him that I was leaving the facility rather than entering. So he was under the impression that I was entering. So so he took the scissors away, and those scissors, the $1.50 pair of scissors ended up costing me about a $15 million career and retirement benefits and 401k contributions. And so subsequently, I talked to the chief pilot and I said, hey, I just want to say thank you very much for allowing us to jump seat. We're always happy to return the favor. I said, but I think there's some confusion here. I said, over these scissors, I says, they're not a prohibited item. He says, listen, don't worry about it. We're always happy to have you guys in our jump seats. We just have a new security team. And so, but he still didn't know that I was exiting the facility, and I didn't realize that at the time. Well, then thereafter, they sent the scissors back to UPS, thinking they wanted to return my property. I mean, if I would have told them, just throw them in the garbage. I don't need them. And they were just grooming scissors. And so subsequently, UPS used this event to sensationalize that I had breached security, I was unprofessional, I compromised UPS jump seat privileges, and they put this false entry in my FAA record.
If any of you watching right now are homeowners, you need to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, because it's one of the fastest growing crimes in the United States of America, according to the FBI. Yes, scammers are stealing home titles, the title to your home, and you won't even know about it. You'll find out only later, because someone has tried to take out a loan in your name. They're trying to target the equity in your home. And here's how it works. Criminals forge your signature on one document. They use a fake notary stamp that they can get on Amazon. They're so cheap, it's ridiculous. They pay a small fee with your county. And then just like that, your home title has been transferred out of your name. It's that easy. Then they take out loans using your equity or even selling your property, and you won't even know it's happened until you get a collection notice or a foreclosure notice in the mail. Can you imagine? So when's the last time you checked on your home's title? If the answer is never, then you need to do something about it right now. That's why I've partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're a victim. Use my promo code REDACTED at HometitleLock.com, and you'll get a free title history report and a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title. That's urgent alerts if there's any changes to your home's title. And if fraud does happen, this is the best part. They will spend up to $1 million to fix it. It's incredible. Natalie and I are paying customers of Home Title Lock. They didn't give me a freebie. They didn't send me a free one because they're on our show. No, we pay for it. We believe it's that important to protect our home's title. That way, if there's ever a problem, we'll be notified about it, and then they can handle it. I don't have a team that can get my title back. They can do it. That's why they'll spend up to $1 million getting the title back on your home. They're fantastic. So go to HometitleLock.com, use the promo code REDACTED. That's HometitleLock.com, and use that promo code REDACTED.
Now, keep in mind, Clayton, if you ever had a mishap, okay, and there was an investigation, if the anti-skid fell and during a landing, if you blew a tire or something happened and you didn't use the proper auto brake setting and went off the end of the runway, when the FAA or the NTSB does an investigation, they go way back into your history from the time you were practically born. And I've had a perfect record. I mean, I'm a highly decorated retired military officer in the Air Force. I had a perfect record at UPS. If you saw my exception history, and I have a copy of it, you can see that. It wasn't until they started targeting me. And so subsequently, they came up with this cockamamie story saying I breached security. And so I insisted that they corrected this report. And I even called the chief pilot at FedEx. His name was Jeff Kilmer. And I told him what had happened. I said, listen, I said, Jeff, this is Doug Green. He says, you remember me about 2 months ago? He says, yeah, what's up? I says, well, UPS is trying to fire me over these scissors. He says, you got to be kidding me. And so he said, I'm going to write a letter to your chief pilot. And he did. And he told him, he said, listen, Captain Green was professional and respectful at all times. We have no problem with his behavior and conduct, and he is more than welcome on our jump seat anytime. And so when he sent that to the company at UPS, they sat on it for almost 2 weeks because they didn't know what to do. And so what had happened is they had rounded up this posse, and UPS security was part of it. And an unstable woman who's, in my opinion, I know it's a strong word, but she's a lunatic, literally. She ran with this story, and she even had suggested, well, maybe I had threatened the chief pilot for him to write that letter. It was preposterous. And so they tried to use this against me. And this was the incident they used to falsify my FAA record to make me look bad on paper. So anyways, as the story progressed and they finally knew that I was onto them, that they had falsified my FAA record and they refused to change it, even with the chief pilot's letter, I had requested, that's what prompted me to file the air whistleblower complaint to the U.S. Department of Labor. It's called an Air 21 whistleblower complaint. And it's a very lengthy process. It takes quite some time to have your case heard. And my case went to the Seattle office. And the investigator, Paul McDevitt, was the same investigator that investigated Carlene Pettit's case. And Paul McDevitt didn't investigate a single thing. With the proper investigation at the Department of Labor, the Office of Inspector General's office has 8 elements of criteria that they're supposed to file an investigation, and he didn't follow a single one. He never interviewed an adverse witness in my case. He didn't do it in Carlene's case. And he basically had said that there was reasonable evidence to conclude that whatever UPS said was true, but I had given him mountains of evidence to show him that it wasn't true, and I never even flew with these guys. And so, but he didn't do anything about it. He dismissed my case. And so when they dismiss your case, Clayton, it's basically an effort to test your resolve to take it to the next level, which is an appeal to an administrative law judge. And my case, like Carlene's, it actually went to the same administrative law judge, a guy by the name of Scott Morris. Now, Scott Morris had a history of dismissing pilot Air 21 cases. Carlene was very fortunate because she had a lot of exposure. And the reason she had a lot of exposure is because Steve Dixon was the chief pilot that had targeted her because she had raised safety concerns. And he was in the process of being confirmed as the new FAA administrator. There's more to that story, and his involvement with the 737 MAX program. Now they tried to recertify it, but I'm going to stay on topic. So McDevitt, he didn't do his job. He didn't do anything that he was supposed to. We have mountains of evidence. We have a FOIA request showing that he didn't interview a single adverse witness, none of the pilots that lied about me, which was required. And so he dismissed the case, and it went to Morris, and basically Morris rubber stamped it, and I never got my day in court. Literally, Clayton, I spent over $500,000 over the past 13 years of my life trying to get my day in court. I filed, and then so eventually this unjust case, basically they said, well, Green's on to us. They knew my attorney and I were onto the fact that they were trying to allege that I had a behavior concern because they said I was harassing pilots by talking about a story. I never even talked to these guys about this story, the guys that lied about me, the troubled pilots. And so subsequently, when they knew that we were onto them, after they went after me professionally, now they try to go after my medical. And this is what they do. First professionally, then medically. And if they can't get you medically, then they try to send you to a psychological screening, or they abuse what's called the HIMSS program, the Human Intervention Motivational Study Program, which is a fancy word for substance abuse. And if they can get anybody and everybody into that program, they will, because you're only one false positive drug test away from losing your job. With their progressive discipline, 3 strikes and you're out. And somebody's just got to lie about you. And it's all based on hearsay, which is forbidden in accordance with the federal rules of civil procedure and federal rules of evidence. So subsequently, now they're trying to target my medical, alleging that they had objective evidence that I may have a medical problem based on these 3 pilots that fabricated these stories about me. And we have overwhelming evidence to show that these were manufactured by the company with the union, and they basically held these guys' jobs over their head to write these false statements. And the statements on their face are preposterous at best. As a matter of fact, one of the pilots alleged that he was at a social gathering with me in Hong Kong on a layover. And he was actually, and that is true, we were, but he was literally inebriated, and he did have an alcohol problem. And that's why he left his former job, but UPS didn't know about it. And subsequently, he had fabricated this story. And we don't believe that Mark McDermott, who was one of the pilots that lied about me, fabricated this story. We believe that Tony Coleman, the attorney that I mentioned to you earlier that worked for Frost, Brown and Todd, wrote it, because Mark McDermott, his vernacular isn't good enough to write the false statement that was presented. But they had alleged that I had made voluminous statements about UPS targeting me in brown helicopters. And And then he said, but Green's attorney had uncovered the nefarious attempt to target him. And what was funny about this, Clayton, is I hadn't even hired an attorney yet. This ensuing battle didn't start until September of 2013. But this event that this Jennifer Robbins used to target me, she actually sent a letter to the head scheduler, a guy by the name of Robbie Buchanan. I want to know all pilots that were in Hong Kong on the 4th of July, because she was looking for her bad boys, troubled pilots, and what we also call moles. Because what they do, like for instance, in the undisclosed DOI with Michael Starnes, it was undisclosed to the FAA, and they basically covered it up. And there was another pilot by the name of Mark Hurst who had an undisclosed DOI, and UPS had recruited an attorney in Anchorage, Alaska, to sweep it under the carpet in exchange for their cooperation to make up stories about other pilots, of which Michael Starnes had made countless stories up about too many pilots to talk about in a short period of time. But what was amazing about this whole thing is Jennifer Robbins, the security representative, had sent a letter to labor saying that I want to know if Mark Hurst ever flew with Doug Green. And so, you have to ask yourself, and this was all in discovery, Clayton, 6,000 pages of discovery that they dumped on us in a document dump 24 hours prior to an arbitration hearing. And so in any case, the question asked, why are you asking if Green ever flew with Mark Hurst? Well, the reason why is that we have the run sheet on both Michael Starnes and Mark Hurst that they had DUIs, and they pled guilty, no contest, and they actually had to wear an ankle bracelet. But they lied to the company initially, saying that they were sick, when in fact they weren't. When the company found out, they covered it up. And so these guys were used as what we call moles to lie about pilots, of which there's too many to count. And so, now I'm fighting this targeting of my medical, and at the time I already knew that they're going to try to get rid of me. And so I told my family, I want everybody to go out, see your doctor, get a checkup, get your teeth cleaned, refill your prescriptions. I went to my personal family doctor, and I got a full medical, almost an astronaut physical from head to toe, clean bill of health. She said, there's nothing wrong with you, you're in good shape. And I also had my current FA first class medical that was not even 30 days old. So I told the company, I filed a grievance. I says, they tried to order me to a company designated AME named Petra Elig, and she was working in collaboration with their main henchman in Phoenix, Arizona, a guy by the name of David Bryman, who was targeting several pilots, and to include John Hurd, who gave a statement, a witness statement to the NTSB in the crash of 1354. And they tried to make John look like he was bipolar and had a medical problem, but they were unsuccessful because I helped John keep his job after they targeted me. And so as a result of trying to target my medical, they were ordering me to go to the company designated AME, but it was a setup. I mean, I already knew that they were lying about me about this behavior issue. We know you're a good pilot, but you have a behavior problem. That's what they said. And our investigation.
The behavior is that you are speaking out about the safety issues with our airline. That's the behavior, Captain, that you're.
Thank you. That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Clayton. And we have mountains of evidence. The evidence is so overwhelming. That's why I can't get my day in court. And so subsequently, Petra Elig, who was the person that was put up by our occupational health supervisor, a gal by the name of Kathy Klein, she's retired, she no longer works there. She was put up to it. And in the discovery, we got all the notes from her journal, and Petra Elig was terrified to move forward. So eventually we conceded to go see what this company designated AME meeting was all about. And my attorney was on a conference call. And she asked me, do you know why you're here? I says, I know exactly why I'm here. I said, I've been speaking out about safety and security and being targeted by the company. And she says, well, no, not really. She says, actually, you're here because the company's concerned that when people have behavior problems, sim failures, check ride failures, show up disheveled to work, things like this, they want to have a closer look at the pilot. I said, well, that's interesting. You mind if I interject? I says, I've never failed a sim check in my life. I've never failed a check ride. And I always wear my airline uniform like a military uniform because I'm very proud of I'm representing the company. I said, so no, that's not why we're here. And so anyways, my attorney chimed in because he was on conference call. And he says, you do realize Captain Green holds a recent first-class medical. And he said, Captain Green, please give Dr. Ely the letter from your personal family doctor that you just recently received. He said, are you going to question another medically certified, board certified doctor here in Anchorage, Alaska? She says, well, he might have a current medical and maybe he just saw a doctor, but a medical is just like inspecting a prop on an airplane. It could have just had a C check, but you never know. Now it might have something wrong with it. And so she was literally comparing my health to a propeller on an airplane. And so my attorney said, listen, I've heard enough. He says, Doug, we know what's going on here. And he said to her, you know what's going on here. This meeting's over. And so he said, I advise you to leave immediately. And so he hung up the phone. And I told her, I'm sorry, I have to concede to the advice of my counsel. So that's what happened. Well, in the log and all the discovery, we had emails back and forth between Petra Elig, Kathy Klein of Occupational Health, and David Bryman, who's their main henchman in Arizona, where she was terrified to continue to try to see me again because she was worried about a malpractice suit. And she deferred to Bryman, David Bryman, that he should conduct any company designated exam. Well, months later, after they terminated me, and I'm going to get to that in just a second, Clayton, months later, actually a couple of years later, fighting this battle from the district court to the circuit court, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, Bryman, I spoke to both Bryman and Ely via email, and I said, please disclose all information, if any and all contact you've ever had with UPS pertaining to Captain Douglas Green. And they both lied and said they never spoke to each other, and they hadn't received any. Bryman said he hadn't received any information about Captain Doug Green, but we have mountains of evidence showing he did, and he was communicating with Kathy Klein, Petra Elig the entire time to target my medical. Petra Elig acknowledged that she did have a letter from me, from my medical doctor, and she spoke to my attorney, but she denied ever speaking to David Bryman. We have all the emails showing that they did. And this security representative, this Jennifer Robbins, she had sent all these false statements written by these pilots that I never flew with to Bryman, alleging that I had behavior concerns and that I was an unstable person and not fit for duty. And we have all of this to prove it. And Bryman acknowledged receiving this information in the email exchange and discovery. So you can just see the lengths that they went to and how nefarious they were to try to end my employment. So nonetheless, I was already in the process of trying to find another job because I knew if I was faced with a termination, it would be like the kiss of death and I would never get hired. And so I did get another job. I actually went through an astronaut physical and I was hired by Korean Airlines as a 747 captain. And then once UPS found out where I was, they basically targeted me and they blackballed me, said disparaging things about me. And Korean Airlines stopped both my training and my partner's training without stating why. And then the instructor that they had assigned to me, he basically told the truth later. And I have an audio file to that effect saying that he was put up to it. And now my partner, who's a good guy, Perry Ritchie, he was actually hired by UPS about a year after that. Now he's a manager in Anchorage, Alaska. He hasn't retired already. So the whole thing was just extremely nefarious. And so they suggested that I refuse to go to a third medical exam, but there never was a third medical exam. It was a complete lie. And so Tony Coleman, who was a choreographer of this scheme, he knew we're going to get Green either way. If we know he won't submit to a medical because it would end his career, but we'll just fire him for insubordination. And that's what they do, Clayton. They use insubordination as one of their tactics. So they said that because I refused to go to a medical, they fired me for insubordination. And it was a complete lie.
So, I mean, of course, you're not the only one in all of this. You're the tip of the spear in a lot of ways, and you're founding of the Whistleblower Pilots Association. How many pilots have now joined you with similar stories? I mean, yours is horrific, and having your career ruined because of these people simply for pointing out safety concerns. How many people have now come to you? How many other pilots? And you were at UPS. We've got Delta Airlines, all across the industry, this is happening, right?
Oh, it's true. It's absolutely true. You know, I've had countless pilots come forward. As a matter of fact, after they fired me, I went to a completely rigged arbitration by a corporate attorney named Barry Winograd. And the whole thing was a setup from start to finish. He allowed them to dump 6,000 pages of discovery in less than 24 hours. You know, I had an expert witness named Bruce Chin. And I would like to read this to you because Carlene Pettit, it's on her blog. And Bruce Chin was an expert witness for us during this arbitration process. They wouldn't allow him to come in. They wouldn't allow him to basically give his statement via video teleconferencing, even though UPS had brought an undisclosed witness that basically fabricated a story, but he never saw me, named Joseph Tordella. But nonetheless, Carlene had some interaction with Bruce Chin, and Bruce Chin had wrote that nothing in the subjective evidence that UPS alleged that I had a medical problem about. He said, there's nothing in the subjective evidence to show this airman has a medical problem. He said, if anything, it shows extreme employer abuse towards an employee. And then Carlene had spoke to Chin, you know, a couple years later, and this is what he told her, and it's in her blog. She said, Dr. Bruce Chin is a doctor that believes he's doing right by the pilots because he can't be bought, but only his silence can. He told me that after he unknowingly tried to help UPS Captain Doug Green, that he learned that airlines bought doctors, and that he would never help a pilot again in this situation. He told me that UPS tried to put him on the payroll, but he wouldn't. He also stated that he simply tells the airline he is busy. He said, this is a dirty business, but it's okay to tell them you're busy because then they don't get mad at you. We tried to get Bruce Chin to cooperate after he gave an expert witness affidavit because the arbitrator refused to allow his testimony at the arbitration hearing, even though he allowed UPS to bring in some cockamamie doctor that was paid off to give a false statement without ever seeing me. But nonetheless, Bruce Chin was afraid, and he told me after the fact that because we reached out to him, that he was involved with the FAA at a higher level now, and he didn't want to seem like he was taking sides. So, you know, and then my attorney at the time had contacted Chin, and this was before Carlene spoke with him, and I read this blog, and he said that UPS had bribed him to try to put him on the payroll, but he refused. So Carlene's blog and her speaking with him corroborated the story. So the whole thing's just, it's a rigged fight from start to finish. And then once you get into the court system to try to appeal an arbitrator decision, it's just not going to happen. Between the mobbed up judges in the courts and their crony law clerks that falsify information, which is literally another interview in itself. What I went through, Clayton, filing an appeal in the district court to the circuit court to the U.S. Supreme Court, it was just a filibuster of justice from start to finish. And it's a rigged fight. You know, the judge at the district court basically handed the case off to a couple crony law clerks from the University of Louisville and University of Kentucky, Colton Givens, and another guy by the name of Andrew Hagerman. And they're probably surprised I know their name, but they were so reckless. They're just young kids, you know, who were coerced and promised, we're going to make you a judge someday. You just got to go along to get along. And they forgot to take their name off the properties on the PDF file. So I knew who they were. And I found out, and they basically falsified the evidence. They didn't look at a single piece of discovery, and they basically dismissed the case on a motion for summary judgment, which for your listeners, it's basically a motion submitted by a heavy paid high hitter law firm to the judge, who's a co-opted judge, and they're all interconnected, every single one of them. They're all in the same cabal. But they can't dismiss the case in a motion for summary judgment because Rule 56 under Federal Rules of Civil Procedure is very clear. It says if there's one material fact in dispute, it must go to a jury trial. But they refused, and they lied because we provided evidence and discovery with thousands of material facts in dispute, and they just whimsically dismissed the case. So when it got to the circuit court, I filed a jury trial, a Federal Civil Procedure Rule 38 jury trial demand. And they just ignored my motion for the jury trial demand. Now, what's most interesting that you and your listeners should know about how rigged the system is, without going into too much detail. Colton Givens and Hagerman were two of the law clerks that Thomas B. Russell in the Western District Court of Kentucky was using. And Colton Givens had basically wrote the pleading to dismiss my case at the district court level. Well, I had to file an appeal to the circuit court. And when it goes to the circuit court, Clayton, it's a de novo review, meaning anew from the beginning, new eyes, new judges. They have to look at all the evidence, new law clerks. Well, we found out that Clayton Givens was contemporaneously law clerking for the circuit court judge Eugene Seiler in the Sixth Circuit Court, who was friends with Thomas B. Russell. And during this contemporaneous clerking, he actually answered my appeal to the Sixth Circuit Court of the decision that he wrote to dismiss my case in the district court. This is fraud upon the court by the court. And so then I had to file for a petition for rehearing en banc, and subsequently they ran me out of money. I had to represent myself pro se. And I literally, Clayton, being a pilot, I had to become an expert on the law. I learned all the federal rules of civil procedure. I had to learn the Supreme Court rules. And I had to file a petition for writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court. But once again, that's like winning the lottery, Clayton. It's supposed to be a court of oversight, and I had proven that there was a circuit court split, meaning that the circuit courts they're supposed to use stare decisis precedent on the rule of law, which is a Latin word for the precedent of court. So if a court's already ruled on a similar case, there's overwhelming evidence to prove it's true, especially when fraud is involved, because Federal Rules of Civil Procedure 60B3 says if there's fraud and misrepresentations, there is no statute of limitations, and that the case can be reheard and dismissed. But they never would allow me to have my case reheard. And so I had to file it to the Supreme Court. I clearly established in my writ of certiorari, and you can look it up, Douglas Walter Green with an E on the end, Supreme Court SCOTUS website, and you'll see it. And I actually sent you a copy of it previously in some of our correspondence. But the writ of certiorari piggybacks, it clearly established that there was a circuit court split, and that the Supreme Court didn't have a choice but to listen to my case, but they didn't. It was just dismissed because UPS and their dark money influence through guys like Mitch McConnell, who's a recipient of dark money, a recipient of UPS. He basically calls his buddies up there at the Supreme Court and these law clerks, because the law clerks at the Supreme Court level are the ones that actually decide if a case is going to be heard. And they never will hear a case by an average American. The average American never gets their day in court. It's absolute abomination. So Clayton, I spent years, literally 10 years, writing until my fingers were bleeding, learning the law, while at the same time I found a new job after Korean Airlines, and I was going through one of the hardest airline training programs in the world, where I'm currently flying for the past 10 years. And you should know I have an impeccable record, and I've received multiple awards for aerial achievement with engine failures and things like this, with 373 passengers on board, with safe landing on a single engine, things like this. Impeccable record. But they tried to denigrate my character. No matter how hard they try, they can't do it, because the truth of who I am, they can't take that away from me. But what I wanted to say to you is about these law clerks, okay? When people read my petition for writ of certiorari, I had people from all over contacting me, on X platform, on personal email, because my email address was on the petition. I had people calling me, pilots, even people in other forms of arbitration that were being targeted, and they were trying to institute the FAIR Act and forced arbitration, which I firmly believe that should be the case, because it's simply a rigged fight. And so this is how I came into contact with a lot of pilots, and especially through the HIMSS program, where they were targeting so many pilots with fraudulent allegations of substance abuse and alcohol addiction. And so I've been helping countless pilots over the past few years. Captain Mark Knowles, one of the most recent pilots that UPS targeted, and his case was equally as nefarious as mine. And his case also went to Scott Morris, But Scott Morris knew that there was so much evidence, and I had helped Mark Noah, and I had actually recommended it to the same attorney that Carleen Pettit was successful, Lee Seaham. And Lee, he's a stand-up attorney, very rare to find in this day and age, because once companies like UPS find out who your attorney is, they just pay him off because they know that they'll pay to play. And so, but Lee Seaham wouldn't go down that road. And so Mark Noah had his representation. He had my help and guidance and some other targeted UPS employees. And subsequently, Scott Morris knew that he didn't have a choice. And he basically told UPS, I'm going to have to hear this case unless you settle. And just recently, we got a FOIA document, and that UPS had nefariously settled out of court with Mark Noah, and he had to sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, and then they had requested that the record be sealed because they didn't want the flying public to know how UPS ruthlessly targets their employee. And you should know, this is a company that alleges they have a code of conduct that upholds integrity, honesty, no retaliation, accuracy in records. But everything that UPS alleges is a part of their moral code is everything that they basically order their managers to violate and to target me and countless other UPS employees. And basically what it does, Clayton, it creates a chilling effect at the airline and within the airline industry for pilots to keep their heads down and to not report anything. UPS's company policy says if you see something, say something. But no, if you see something, you better keep your mouth shut or else you're going to lose your job. And like I tell guys, the bottom line in this particular situation, I just want to read it from my notes here because it's not memorized, but the bottom line is the attempt of the airline industry to abuse the HIMSS program, to weaponize fitness for duty tests, to allege professional misconduct or behavior, false allegations. They do this to make the perfect compliant pilot. I call it the PCP, the perfect compliant pilot. They'll do whatever they tell them to do, and they'll keep their heads down. They'll take an airplane that has a malfunctioning hydraulic system. They'll come to work sick. They'll fly when they're fatigued. And this is an absolute threat to the flying public's safety. And so the bottom line is you either be the perfect compliant pilot or risk not only losing your seniority-based job, but also risk losing your career to never fly again in another airplane. That's the bottom line. And what UPS did to me after the fact, Clayton, they stalked me like a dog and they blackballed me no matter where I went and what I did. And they basically falsified, well, not basically, they did. The FAA has a program, it's called PREA, that stands for the Pilot Records Improvement Act. And basically, if you get another job, if you want to get another job, the airline that you're applying to has to request your records. And if there was a termination, they have to state what the reason for the termination is, and they have to send training records and things like this. Well, UPS, in violation of 18 U.S. Code 1001, providing false and fictitious information, has been holding this information, alleging that I had a medical problem, when in fact they knew that I didn't. And overwhelming evidence substantiated that it was all manufactured as a grounds to basically force me to a medical, to either take my medical away fraudulently or to fire me for insubordination. And so they sent these documents to my employer after Korean Airlines, which was a US airline named Western Global Airlines. And Western Global Airlines, they asked me about it. They requested the PREA. And I says, well, do you want me to defend a lie or do you want me to tell you the truth? And they said the truth. And they needed MD-11 captains with my experience. I had over 3,000 hours in the MD-11. And so I says, well, the bottom line is I was embroiled in a labor dispute with UPS. They targeted me. They made false accusations by pilots that were troubled with and in trouble with the company and violated federal law. And subsequently, I had to defend all this. And then when that didn't work, they targeted my medical, and I wouldn't entertain it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be flying today. They would have tried to ground me permanently, like they did Dan Hanley at United Airlines, and Carleen Pettit, and several other pilots. Those that didn't take the jab, like Bahi Saliba at American Airlines. Basically, Clayton, what you need to understand is these airlines, and I know Bahij told you a little bit about this, and it's quite complicated for the listener, but I'm going to try to make it simple. Bahij is an amazing, amazing thinker, and he studied the rule of law. But just to make it a little bit simpler, basically, in accordance with the Federal Aviation Act of 1958, they set up the ground rules by Congress of the FAA administers the rules and regulations. They enforce the enforcement action, the licensing of pilots, the medical certificates, and this medical relationship for a medical certificate holder is exclusively between the FAA and the pilot. But the airlines are trying to act as interveners in this process now, just like they did with the vaccines and the jab. Now they're trying to put language in the collective bargaining agreements that falsely alleges that they can send you to a company designated AME, in other words, a paid off aviation medical examiner. But the bottom line is the FAA AME guide and the rule of law and regulatory law with the FAA says that no one can question a medical certificate holder's fitness for duty except the FAA federal air surgeon, and only if there's a reasonable basis to do so. And then it says in big bold letters in the AME guide, and not an AME, an aviation medical examiner, meaning some Yahoo doctor. These doctors, they're AMEs. It's very, very easy to become an AME. I mean, you could have a degree in basket weaving and then say you're a doctor. Next thing you know, you're an AME. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's pretty close to the truth. And as Dr. Chin said, doctors can be bought. And so, but the long and short of it is this relationship between the FAA and the medical certificate holder is a sacred one. And it's public policy. And they're violating public policy to try to insert themselves as interveners so they can control the process. And the language in the contract, the collective bargaining agreements, CBAs we call them, basically is unlawful. For them to suggest that we believe we have objective evidence and they can send it to a company that does AME is unlawful. And even in the contract, especially at UPS, it says that anything in this contract that violates the rule of law, the law prevails. But see, the arbitrators, they take it to an arbitrator, which is the Railway Labor Act, has nothing to do with this nefarious scheme of how they're trying to abuse the intent of the FAA and the sacred relationship between the FAA and the medical certificate holder. So they use the Railway Labor Act to get some paid off crony corporate attorney like Barry Winograd to act as this intervener, and then you're forced to go through the legal system. Now, if I knew back then what I know now, Clayton, I would have never entertained it, and I would have gone directly to the FAA Federal Air Surgeon. And they don't want to sit now. If they really believe that a pilot like Carlene or Dan Hanley or myself had a genuine medical problem, it would be incumbent upon UPS or the airline that's targeting the pilot to send whatever concerns they had directly to the regional FAA Federal Air Surgeon. And the Federal Air Surgeon would look at their discovery. They would call the pilot in. They would interview the pilot. The pilot would have a chance to defend himself, especially in my case. It was so easy to defend myself. That's why I can't get this case into a court of law, because the mountains of evidence. And UPS knows that it would be done in less than 60 minutes. All I have to do is interview the three pilots and prove that they made false statements or coerced to do so, and it would be game over. But nonetheless, the FAA is not providing the level of enforcement action they should. The Department of Labor is providing the level of enforcement action they should. And you're going to fight and fight and fight, but because the United States has become a lawless country, it's almost like a fight that you're just never going to win. You're never going to get into a court. I mean, can you imagine? And I apologize for doing all the talking, but can you imagine, Clayton?
That's right.
how many Americans have $500,000 lying around to try to get their day in court?
Well,
not many.
Very few of them. And of all the pilots I've spoken to in this similar situation, they've had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to get their day in court, and almost none of them have been able to do so, save one or two, if you're lucky.
So
So
much for the Seventh Amendment to the right to a jury trial, or the Fifth Amendment to you can't be denied life, liberty, or property without due process, or the
yeah,
14th Amendment, equal protection of the law. There is no law in America. It's all a joke. It's a ruse. The only
well,
cases you ever the only cases you actually ever see are celebrity cases, and it's all for show. It's all theater. Just like
right.
in Congress. Recently Josh Hawley had interviewed Dick Calhoun of Boeing. This is all theater. Even Thomas Massey of Kentucky, who's an American hero, one of few, he said it's all theater. And it is. Dick Calhoun knew exactly what Josh Hawley was going to say. Josh Hawley
Mhm.
knew his responses. It's all a joke. And what they do is, if there's any enforcement action, there's a little slap on the hand, naughty, naughty, don't do that again. And they levy a big fine, just like in the recent ruling by the U.S. Department of Justice, giving basically Boeing a pardon on the mishap of the
Yeah.
737 with Lion Air and Ethiopia. And that's another interview. I can tell you everything about that story. I know every single detail, but I don't want to really
Yeah.
talk about that right now because I don't want to get targeted by Boeing. I still have 6 more months before I retire, So no,
Yeah.
I've never gotten my day in court. I've never been afforded my right to walk into a courtroom to judge the credibility of known perjured witnesses, and there's not much more a person can do. And so that's why we're
Well,
here. We're here
yeah.
because you and Natali and the Redacted show is one of the greatest opportunities for Americans and people across the world to bring our cases to the court of public opinion.
Well, I appreciate your bravery. I just wanted to sort of sit back and have you tell your story because it's unique, but it's not unique because there are so many other pilots who are trying to warn America and warn the American airline industry about the safety concerns, whether it's fatigue or it's pilot training or concerns about aircraft manufacturing or problems all across the industry, from Delta to UPS to you name it. They have these issues, and so thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your story. Where can people learn more about the whistleblowers, and if they are a whistleblower, a pilot whistleblower who wants to speak out and come forward, where can they go?
Well, actually, Captain Dan Hanley and I were involved in a couple different projects. I think you're aware of that. I'm also co-director with him on 911pilots.org and through WAPA. We have a domain name. The actual website is still work in progress, but it's WAPA, WAPA.international. And but to really try to get a hold of us and share, other people share their stories or whatever dilemma they might be currently be in, like Captain Mark Noah or Captain Gerald Brown, Captain John Hurd, the list goes on and on and on. Mike Danforth, Carl Suring, Mike Protak. I mean, I can't tell you how many pilots. Literally, Clayton, this is a pandemic that has been created by the airline industry working in collusion with the FAA to allow this to happen. The FAA is no longer a regulatory agency. It's a regulated agency by the airline industry, the dark money of the airline industry. And, I really didn't go into anywhere near the tentacles of my case and how we tried to force the FAA to do their job. Because the FAA, they just rubber stamped the Department of Labor decision. We have overwhelming evidence they didn't investigate a single thing, and they were supposed to. As a matter of fact, the FAA had contacted the U.S. Department of Labor and this Paul McDevitt, who's now retired, who's guilty of epic fraud. They had contacted him and said, how come we never got the discovery in the Green case? And he just dismissed it. He says, well, we had a temp secretary at the time. That's probably what happened. But we have a permanent secretary now, and I'm sure things will be better, but he didn't answer the question. So the FAA rubber stamped my case, the Department of Labor dismissal, without ever even getting any evidence to investigate it. Is that kind of getting the cart before the horse, or is it just me?
No, it's not just you. But thank you so much for telling your story. I know there's so many different angles to it. I know we're way over time, but thank you so much for your bravery in telling this story, Captain Doug. I appreciate it, and hopefully we can have you back on as this unfolds. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, it's so great to be with you. And, just in closing, I'd just like to say our biggest hope is that we just want to make the flying public aware that they are in harm's way. When you get on that airplane and you take a look to the left and you think that flight deck and the airplane's, fit for duty and fit to fly, it's not always the case. And we want to expose this. We want to bring it to the flying public's attention. But most importantly, we just want to heighten awareness regarding whistleblower suppression in hopes of garnering the public support. And we'd like to find some level of accountability in the prosecution of criminals responsible for the silencing and retaliation against pilot whistleblowers. There's a lot that can be done, but when we have a government that's lawless and they just don't care about the American worker anymore, it's just not going to happen until we take it to this court of public opinion. So thanks again, Clayton. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.